My name is Gwyneth Helga. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been what people describe as steady. Not dazzling, not loud, not difficult, just steady. I live in a quiet coastal city where people measure each other by appearances that feel polite but thin. I work in compliance consulting, an invisible profession that only matters when something goes wrong. I've been married for 11 years. I have no dramatic origin story, no scandal stitched into my name. If you met me at a dinner party, you would probably remember that I listened more than I spoke. And that is how they saw me. A woman who absorbed tension, a wife who trusted easily, a presence that did not disrupt the room. I don't say that with bitterness, I say it as a fact. There's something about calm women that people misunderstand. They think calm means unaware. They think gentleness means fragility. They assume that if you're not fighting, you're not thinking. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about screaming matches or dramatic exits. There are no broken plates, no exposed secrets shouted across a driveway. It's about something quieter. He swore there was no other woman. Then she knocked on my door. And what followed wasn't chaos. It was clarity. The confrontation that neither of them planned became my awakening. But not in the way you might expect. This is not a story about catching someone in the act. It's not about dramatic betrayal, with cinematic music swelling in the background. It's about the slow erosion of certainty. It's about the small cuts that don't bleed immediately. It's about what happens when you begin to realize that the role you've been playing in your own life was quietly assigned to you by someone else. I will tell you everything honestly, not to vilify him, not to humiliate her, not to paint myself as a saint. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized what didn't make sense. I chose peace when I should have chosen truth. And when truth finally arrived, uninvited, unpolished, standing on my front step, it did not explode my world. It reorganized it. What I learned in those weeks that followed changed the way I see trust, silence, power, and myself. If you have ever felt underestimated, if you have ever mistaken patience for weakness, if you have ever wondered whether staying calm meant you were losing, then perhaps you will understand why the knock on my door was not the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of my sovereignty. Tell me, have you ever realized too late that you were playing a role someone else wrote for you? Before everything shifted, I was the reasonable one. That's what they called me. At dinner parties, when my husband would interrupt me mid-sentence to clarify what I meant, people would smile indulgently. "He's just passionate," someone would say. And I would nod, because I had learned that correcting small humiliations often created larger discomfort. I preferred smooth surfaces. To his colleagues, I was lovely. To his mother, I was steady. To our friends, I was so understanding. It was a word people used when they wanted to compliment you without acknowledging your complexity. Understanding meant I didn't challenge him in public. Understanding meant I didn't question late meetings. Understanding meant I trusted. I had built my adult life around competence. I understood contracts, clauses, and risk exposure. I could see structural weaknesses in corporate systems within minutes. At work, people paid for my scrutiny. At home, I withheld it. Not because I was incapable, but because I believed marriage required faith more than analysis. He was charismatic in a way that filled rooms. People leaned toward him when he spoke. He was good at narratives, at shaping events into stories that favored him. And I admired that. I told myself that every couple has different strengths. Mine was steadiness. His was brilliance. When small inconsistencies appeared, I reframed them. If he seemed distracted, I assumed pressure. If he guarded his phone, I assumed privacy. If he grew impatient with my questions, I assumed exhaustion. The mind is very capable of protecting the life it wants to keep. To our circle, I was the woman who had it all together. The organized one, the planner, the quiet intelligence behind our household finances. What they didn't see was how often I edited myself mid-thought, how often I softened a question into something harmless. "Did you get home late?" Became "long evening." "Why did you delete that message?" Became silent. I wasn't afraid of him. That's important. There was no shouting, no threats, no cruelty that left visible marks. What existed was subtler, a slow rebalancing of gravity in which his version of reality weighed slightly more than mine. If I remembered something differently, he would pause, just long enough to introduce doubt. "Are you sure?" He'd say gently. "You've been stressed lately." And because I respected him, because I trusted him, because I loved him, I would re-examine myself first. I told myself that humility was a virtue. That compromise was maturity. That harmony required flexibility. I did not notice that flexibility was becoming erasure. To them, I was lucky. To him, I was stable. To myself, I was becoming smaller in ways that did not register immediately. There is a particular loneliness in being perceived as strong. People assume you don't need reassurance. They assume you can absorb uncertainty without consequence. They assume you will adjust. And I did adjust, again and again, until the adjustments began to feel less like love and more like quiet self-abandonment. But if you had asked me then whether something was wrong, I would have smiled. I would have described our life as solid. I would have defended him with calm conviction, because at that time I still believed that the story I was living was the one we had written together. I did not yet understand that I had been cast in a role, and roles once assigned are rarely questioned until someone forgets their lines. The first cut was so small it barely registered. That's the dangerous kind. It wasn't lipstick on a collar. It wasn't a mysterious perfume. It wasn't even a suspicious text message. It was laughter. We were at a colleague's birthday gathering. Dim lights, too loud music, and polite wine glasses balanced on narrow tables. I was standing beside him, listening as he told a story about one of our early trips together. A simple memory. We had gotten lost in the Lake District, arguing over a paper map because there was no signal. In my memory, we laughed about it. In his version, I had panicked, overreacted, completely hopeless with directions, he said lightly, smiling at the group. They laughed. I smiled too. But something inside me tightened, because that wasn't what happened. I remember staying calm while he insisted we were heading north instead of west. I remember suggesting we stop and ask someone for directions. I remember him refusing. I remember gently persuading him to turn around. We didn't argue, I didn't panic. Yet in the retelling, I became the flustered wife, and he the amused navigator. It was subtle, playful, harmless even, except it wasn't true. I waited for him to glance at me, to share that conspiratorial look couples use when exaggerating stories. He didn't. He continued, layering detail onto the version that made him competent and me endearingly chaotic. Someone touched my arm. "Oh, I love that about you," she said. "You're so emotional." Emotional. I swallowed the correction. I could have said, "That's not how it happened," but the moment had momentum. Interrupting would have felt defensive, overly serious, humorless, so I let it pass. On the drive home, I mentioned it gently. "You made it sound like I was panicking that day," I said, watching the dark road ahead. He sighed, not irritated, just faintly weary. "Gwyn, it was a joke. I know, it just wasn't accurate." "It doesn't matter. People don't fact-check dinner stories." There it was. "It doesn't matter." He reached for my hand briefly and squeezed it in reassurance. "You're overthinking." And that phrase settled into me like a splinter. Overthinking. I work in risk analysis. My profession depends on noticing small discrepancies before they become catastrophes. I am trained to treat minor inconsistencies as early warning signs. But in my marriage, I dismissed the instinct. Because he wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant. He still kissed my forehead in the mornings, still asked about my day, still told people I was brilliant, just not in ways that disrupted the image he preferred. The small cut wasn't the misrepresentation. It was the ease with which he rewrote a shared memory, and the ease with which everyone accepted it, including me. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing similar adjustments, tiny shifts in narrative. If we disagreed privately and later spoke about it publicly, his version always sounded calmer, more reasonable. My concerns became worries. My questions became doubts. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me directly. He simply framed reality more persuasively, and each time I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. Marriage, I believed, required generosity. Wasn't it generous to let small inaccuracies go? Wasn't it mature to avoid correcting your partner over trivialities? But something inside me had begun recording, not in anger, in awareness. The first small cut doesn't bleed dramatically. It doesn't demand stitches. It doesn't even look like harm. It looks like humor. It sounds like affection. It feels like nothing, until you realize you are the only one who remembers the original story. The thing about small cuts is that once you survive the first one, the second feels easier to ignore, not because it hurts less, but because you've already practiced explaining it away. After the dinner party story, I became more attentive. Not suspicious, just observant. I told myself I was being mindful, not defensive. I didn't want to turn into the kind of woman who scanned every interaction for insult. And yet, patterns began forming. When we hosted friends, he would tease me about my spreadsheets for everything. I do keep detailed budgets, structured travel plans, and organized files. I once considered it a strength. In his voice, it became a charming quirk, harmless, slightly excessive. She even budgets our grocery list, he'd say, laughing. If I buy the wrong brand, I get audited. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But what they didn't know was that he rarely noticed the stability those spreadsheets created. The mortgage was paid early. The emergency fund is quietly growing. The investments I researched while he slept. The joke turned diligence into rigidity, control into obsession, and because it was framed as affection, I told myself it was affectionate. There were other moments. If I questioned a sudden expense, he would sigh and say, "Relax, Gwyn, not everything is a board meeting." If I expressed discomfort about a female colleague texting him late at night, he would tilt his head slightly. "You don't actually think something's going on, do you?" The tone was gentle, almost amused, as if the idea itself were so implausible it bordered on adorable. And I would retreat, not because I believed him blindly, but because I did not want to become paranoid in my own mind. There's a peculiar dynamic that develops when one person consistently frames themselves as rational and the other as sensitive. You begin pre-editing your emotions. I would pause before speaking and ask myself, is this logical? Is this fair? Is this calm enough? If I couldn't guarantee it was all three, I stayed quiet. He never explicitly dismissed me. He didn't say, "You're wrong." He said, "You're overthinking." He didn't say, "You're insecure." He said, "You're imagining patterns." I started apologizing more. "I'm probably just tired. Maybe I misunderstood. It's not a big deal." The normalization happened gradually. Disrespect rarely arrives as an announcement. It slips in as humor, as exhaustion, as a minor correction. And because there are no dramatic explosions, you tell yourself there's no real damage. We still had dinner together, still shared weekends, still made plans for holidays. Nothing looked broken, but something subtle was shifting inside me. I began doubting not his loyalty, but my perception. If he came home later than expected, I wouldn't ask immediately. I would gather data first, check traffic reports, consider his workload, rehearse the tone of my voice so that it sounds neutral. When I finally did ask, it came out softened beyond recognition. "Long day?" He would nod, grateful for the simplicity of the question. And the simplicity cost me something each time. I started noticing how often he corrected me mid-sentence, not aggressively, just smoothly. If I misremembered a detail, he would step in. If I summarized an event, he would refine it. In public, he seemed to hold the final edit. I told myself couples balance each other. I told myself my sensitivity was a flaw I needed to manage. I told myself that being easy to live with was a virtue. The most dangerous part wasn't his behavior, it was my accommodation. Because every time I chose harmony over clarity, I reinforced the idea that my internal alarm system was optional. And the more optional it became, the easier it was for him to redefine the tone of our marriage. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, I had already trained myself not to react to it. Disrespect, once normalized, stops looking like disrespect. It looks like personality, and personality, we're told, must be accepted, even if it slowly edits you out of your own story. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize you are no longer responding naturally in your own life. You are performing. I didn't wake up one morning and think, "I've been assigned a role." It unfolded slowly, through repetition, through expectation, through the subtle rewards of compliance. At some point, I became the stabilizer. If he was stressed, I absorbed it. If he was frustrated, I soothed it. If he was distant, I explained it to myself, to others. When friends asked how he was doing during a particularly demanding project, I answered before he could. I managed his narrative. I curated his reputation gently, instinctively, and people admired that about me. "You're so supportive," his mother would say. "He's lucky to have someone so steady," colleagues would add. Supportive, steady, reliable. None of those words are insults, but together they formed a frame. Inside that frame, there was no room for my dissatisfaction, because the steady woman does not destabilize the room. The reliable wife does not introduce uncertainty. The supportive partner does not question late nights too closely. I noticed how often decisions defaulted to him, not because he demanded control, but because I yielded space. Restaurants, travel plans, social commitments, he would suggest that I adapt. If I proposed something and he hesitated, I adjusted the proposal rather than insisting. I told myself I was flexible, but flexibility over time hardened into predictability. He began assuming I would manage the unglamorous details: insurance renewals, tax documents, birthday gifts for his family. He didn't ask, it was simply understood. And I fulfilled it without complaint because I valued competence, because I valued peace, because somewhere in my childhood, I learned that being low maintenance was the safest way to stay loved. That was the emotional wound I rarely examined. The fear of being too much, too demanding, too emotional, too complicated. So I became efficient, contained, minimal in my needs. There were evenings when he would scroll through his phone while I spoke, nodding occasionally. If I paused mid-sentence to see whether he was listening, he would glance up. Sorry, go on? And I would. Shorter this time, more concise. The role I was assigned did not include requiring full attention. It included understanding distraction. It included forgiving oversight. It included interpreting silence generously. I began noticing something else too. When disagreements surfaced, he framed them as logistical differences rather than emotional concerns. If I said, I feel disconnected lately, he would respond with solutions. Let's book a weekend away. If I said, I feel like you dismiss my concerns, he would smile softly. That's not my intention. And intention became the shield. As long as he didn't mean harm, harm was invalidated. Meanwhile, I carried the emotional weight quietly. I made myself smaller to preserve the structure. I convinced myself that strength meant endurance. But endurance without recognition becomes invisibility. And invisibility, when prolonged, begins to feel like erasure. I didn't resent him. That's important. Resentment would have required anger. What I felt was subtler, a faint disorientation, as if I were watching myself from slightly outside my body, competent, pleasant, reliable, and wondering when I had agreed to become only that. The role fits well, too well. No one questioned it, least of all me. Not yet. The shift did not happen during an argument. It did not happen when I found a message or overheard a conversation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows. The house was quiet in that mid-afternoon way, when the world feels pause between obligations. I had taken the day off work to finalize some documents for a client, but my mind was restless, not anxious, just unsettled. He had left early that morning. There was nothing unusual about that. I stood at the sink, watching water slide over a plate I had already cleaned twice. My thoughts were looping around nothing specific. A vague discomfort, a sense of imbalance I couldn't articulate. Then I realized something simple. I could not remember the last time he had asked me a meaningful question. Not about logistics, not about dinner plans or weekend schedules, but about me. Not how was your day as a ritual, but how are you really? And when I searched my memory, I couldn't find it. I dried my hands slowly and sat at the kitchen table with my silver fountain pen and leather journal. I hadn't written in weeks. I told myself I was too busy. In truth, I think I had avoided stillness. Because stillness makes patterns visible. I began writing without intention, just fragments. I feel quieter than I used to. I speak less because it's easier. I am adapting more than I am choosing. The words did not accuse him. They describe me. That was the shift. Until that moment, I had analyzed our marriage in terms of his behavior, his tone, his timing, his narratives. But that afternoon, I turned the lens inward. Why was I shrinking preemptively? Why was I editing myself before speaking? Why did I accept partial attention as sufficient? No one had forced me into silence. I had chosen it, incrementally, strategically, repeatedly. The realization did not feel dramatic. It felt sobering. I had been so focused on maintaining harmony that I never questioned whether harmony required my disappearance. There's a quiet grief in recognizing your own participation in your diminishment. Not self-blame, just accountability. I closed the journal and walked through the house slowly. The rooms looked the same. Neutral walls, framed photographs, carefully curated calm. But something in me had straightened. For the first time in months, I allowed a thought I had been avoiding. What if my discomfort is not overthinking? What if it's data? The word felt clinical, familiar, safe. Data. In my profession, data is not emotional. It is information. It requires evaluation, not apology. If I treated my feelings as data rather than flaws, what would I see? I began replaying conversations, not to criticize him, but to observe myself. The pauses before I spoke, the softened questions, the careful tone adjustments. The pattern was consistent. I was managing perception more than expressing truth. That afternoon, I made no accusations. I sent no messages. I confronted nothing. Outwardly, nothing changed. But internally, a boundary formed. I would stop pre-editing. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, just gradually. I would ask questions in their original shape. I would let silence exist without rushing to fill it. I would observe without announcing that I was observing. The shift was not loud, it was structural. And structure, once reinforced, does not collapse easily. When he came home that evening, he kissed my cheek as usual, asked about my day in the same casual tone. It was productive, I said, and for the first time, I did not add extra reassurance. I simply watched him, not suspiciously, just clearly, and clarity, I would soon learn, changes everything, even before anyone else realizes it has arrived. Before that Tuesday, my silence had been reflexive. After it, my silence became deliberate. There is a profound difference between the two. Reflexive silence is defensive. It avoids friction. It smooths edges before they can be cut. It says, it's fine, even when something isn't. Deliberate silence, however, is observant. It listens longer. It waits. It allows the other person to reveal more than they intended. The first time I practiced it consciously, it felt almost unnatural. He was describing a new project at work. Animated, energized, full of future plans. There was a colleague he mentioned often now, always in passing, always in context. Her name slid into conversation casually, like background noise. Before, I would have asked light, socially acceptable questions. Is she senior? How long has she been there? Questions designed to appear interested but not intrusive. That evening, I simply nodded and let him continue. And because I wasn't interrupting, he kept talking. Details accumulated. How late they'd stayed reviewing proposals. How sharp her insights were. How she challenged him intellectually. He glanced at me briefly, perhaps expecting a reaction. I gave him none. Not coldness, not jealousy, just stillness. He shifted slightly in his seat. You'd like her, he added. She's very direct. I held his gaze a moment longer than usual. I'm sure she is. And then I returned to my tea. Silence unsettles people when they are accustomed to managing the narrative. In the following weeks, I practiced restraint, not in self-suppression, but in observation. If he came home later than planned, I did not ask immediately. I noted the time, I noted the explanation offered, I noted whether it matched previous patterns. If he corrected me mid-sentence in conversation with friends, I did not rush to laugh it off. I let the correction sit in the air for a breath longer than comfortable. Sometimes that breath was enough. I began noticing micro-expressions I had previously dismissed. A flicker of irritation when I didn't immediately agree. A subtle scan of my face when he mentioned her name, as if gauging impact. My calm was no longer compliance. It was an assessment, and he mistook it. One evening, after I declined to attend a networking event with him, he studied me from across the kitchen. You've been quiet lately, he said. I've been thinking. About? Patterns. He laughed lightly. You and your patterns. Before, that would have softened me. This time, I let the statement hang. He waited for elaboration. I offered none. What I realized during those weeks was this. When you stop over-explaining yourself, people begin explaining themselves to you. He volunteered information I hadn't requested. Justifications arrived unprompted. Casual mentions of schedules came with timestamps. I did not accuse. I did not search his phone. I did not stage confrontations. I observed. And the more I observed, the clearer something became. My silence unsettled him not because it was hostile, but because it removed his ability to calibrate me. When I had reacted predictably, smiling, teasing, rationalizing, he knew the temperature of the room. Now the room was neutral, and neutrality feels like distance to someone who relies on emotional cues for reassurance. He began asking more frequently, "Are you all right?" The question sounded concerned, but underneath it I heard something else. "Are you still manageable?" I would meet his eyes calmly. "I'm fine." And for the first time, that sentence was true, because nothing was wrong. But because I was no longer trying to control what was unfolding, I was allowing it to reveal itself. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is space. And in that space, truth becomes impatient. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like a woman maintaining her life. What they never noticed was that my calm had evolved into structure, not suspicion. Structure. I didn't wake up one morning and decide, he's lying. I woke up and decided that if something is wrong, I will not be unprepared. The difference matters. At work, I review risk exposure for a living. I assess vulnerabilities before crises become headlines. I do not accuse companies of misconduct without evidence. I evaluate patterns. So I applied the same discipline at home, quietly. I began with finances, not because I expected betrayal, but because financial clarity is sovereignty. I reviewed our joint accounts with the same attention I would give a corporate audit. Nothing invasive, nothing dramatic, just a comprehensive understanding of inflow, outflow, subscriptions, and recurring transfers. There were no glaring anomalies, just small shifts, more dining expenses than usual, rideshare charges on evenings that were supposedly late meetings, a hotel bar charges once categorized under client entertainment. Individually, they were explainable. Collectively, they formed a rhythm. I didn't confront him. I documented. Dates, amounts, explanations offered. Not to weaponize, to understand. What they never noticed was that my professional instincts had returned home. I updated my personal savings, increased contributions quietly, redirected a portion of my consulting bonuses into an account in my name only. Not secretive, legal, transparent, sensible. If nothing was wrong, this was prudence. If something was wrong, this was leverage. I also did something else. I started listening differently in social settings. At gatherings, I paid attention not to what he said, but to how others responded to him. There was a subtle admiration around him lately, a kind of amused indulgence, particularly from women in his professional circle. One evening, at a charity event, I watched him across the room. He was standing slightly too close to her, the colleague whose name had become ambient in our house. She laughed at something he said and touched his arm briefly. It was fleeting, almost invisible, but I saw it. And what I noticed most was not the touch. It was his posture. He leaned in, not dramatically, but just enough to create intimacy within a public space. When he noticed me observing, he straightened slightly, not guiltily, just recalibrating. Later that night, in bed, he mentioned her again. "She thinks you'd be fascinating to talk to," he said casually, very analytical. I turned toward him slowly. "Does she?" "Yeah, I told her you're brilliant." I held his gaze. "Thank you." And then I watched the faint relief in his shoulders, as if he had just passed a test I hadn't announced. That was when clarity sharpened. If there was nothing to hide, there would be nothing to manage. I did not check his phone. I did not follow him. I did not interrogate. Instead, I prepared. I consulted a lawyer, not about divorce, but about asset structures, about what would happen hypothetically if one partner concealed financial information. The meeting was clinical, informational. He never knew. I updated my professional network quietly, reconnected with former clients, expanded my consulting portfolio. If the ground shifted beneath me, I would not fall. What they never noticed was that the woman they thought was shrinking was actually consolidating. Emotionally, financially, mentally, and the most important preparation of all, I stopped needing confirmation. I no longer required proof to validate my intuition. I trusted my pattern recognition. Whether he was crossing a line or merely approaching it no longer mattered. What mattered was this: I would not be surprised. Because surprise is destabilizing. Clarity is not. The reveal did not arrive in the way most people expect. There was no lipstick stain, no hotel receipt left carelessly in a jacket pocket, no late-night confession fueled by guilt. It came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. He was in the shower upstairs. His phone vibrated on the kitchen counter beside me. Not face down, not hidden, just there, casual, accessible, almost careless. I wasn't looking for it. That's the truth. I had been chopping herbs for dinner, my hands steady, my thoughts elsewhere. The vibration was sharp against the marble. I glanced instinctively. Her name, not the colleague's name he used so freely, her full name, displayed without disguise. There was no heart emoji, no secrecy in presentation, just a notification preview that read, "I can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." The knife paused midair. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I waited, not out of fear, out of intention. The shower was still running. Steam clouded the upstairs hallway. I could hear him moving, unaware. When I finally reached for the phone, my pulse was calm. I did not scroll through months of history. I opened that thread. The conversation was not explicit. It was worse. It was emotionally intimate. Long paragraphs about exhaustion, about feeling misunderstood, about finally being seen, shared frustrations about work, about partners who didn't quite get it. He had written things to her that he had not said to me in months. Not sexual, vulnerable, and vulnerability is more binding than flirtation. There were references to that night after the conference. No description, just implication. I did not need details. Pattern recognition does not require confession. The water upstairs shut off. I placed the phone exactly where it had been. I finished chopping the herbs. My hands did not shake. There was no cinematic collapse, no gasping breath, no tears. Instead, there was alignment. Every small cut, every narrative shift, every defensive laugh, every late meeting, every subtle recalibration, aligned. The revelation was not that he had feelings for someone else. It was that he had built a parallel emotional structure, and assumed I would remain the stabilizing base of the original one. The audacity wasn't in the affair, it was based on my endurance. When he came downstairs, towel around his shoulders, he smiled as he always did. "Smells good," he said. I looked at him fully. For the first time in months, I saw him without the filter of loyalty. He was not a villain. He was a man who believed he could have admiration in two places and lose neither. And in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not rage, not devastation. Distance. A clean, decisive distance. The confrontation neither of them planned became my awakening. But it did not happen that afternoon. The awakening was internal. It was the realization that I was no longer confused, no longer doubting my perception, no longer editing my intuition. I did not confront him about the message. Not yet, because the knowledge itself was leverage. And leverage, when discovered, should not be spent impulsively. That night, as he slept beside me, breathing evenly, I stared at the ceiling and felt something solidify. Trust had shifted from him to me, and once that shift occurs, everything else becomes logistics. Once clarity arrives, emotion becomes secondary. What remains are choices. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was crying, I wasn't. Not because I was spiraling, I wasn't doing that either. My mind was methodical, calm, in a way that almost unsettled me. There were options. Option 1, confront him immediately, hold up the message, demand explanation, watch him scramble for language. Option 2, say nothing, monitor further, gather more evidence. Build a case so airtight that denial would be impossible. Option 3, leave quietly, no confrontation, no spectacle, just absence. Each option carried consequences. The first would satisfy instinct but surrender leverage. The second would extend exposure to disrespect. The third would protect my dignity but deny me closure. I lay there, listening to his breathing, and asked myself a different question. What outcome do I want? Not emotionally, structurally. I did not want an apology. I did not want to compete with another woman for access to my own husband's vulnerability. I did not want a dramatic confession followed by promises to do better. What I wanted was irreversible clarity. If I confronted him too soon, he would shift into narrative mode. He was skilled at that. He would contextualize, minimize, and intellectualize. He would say it was emotional confusion, a stressful period, nothing physical, a mistake. And part of me, the part trained to preserve harmony, might soften. I couldn't allow that. So I chose something quieter. I chose the irreversible option. I would move first. Not emotionally. Legally, financially, practically. And I would do it without announcing my intention. Over the next few days, I behaved as usual. We had dinner, we discussed schedules, we attended a small gathering at a friend's house. I watched him carefully, not for evidence but for confirmation of character. He was attentive in public, subtle in private. His phone remained present but angled slightly more away from me now. He sensed something had shifted. He just didn't know what. On Wednesday afternoon, during my lunch break, I met with the solicitor I had consulted weeks earlier. This time, the conversation was different, not hypothetical, concrete. I asked about asset division, about timelines, about documentation, about emotional affairs and how they factored legally, not because I needed the law to validate my hurt, but because I needed to understand my position clearly. There were no theatrics in that office, just paperwork and procedure. By Friday, I had initiated the formal process. No accusations filed, no dramatic claims, just a structured beginning to an ending. It wasn't impulsive. It was proportionate. When you understand your leverage, you don't raise your voice. You adjust your position. That weekend, he suggested we plan a short trip. Just us, he said. We haven't done that in a while. I looked at him steadily. That might not be necessary. He studied me, searching for tone. What does that mean? It means I'm reconsidering some things. He leaned back slightly. Like what? I held his gaze for a long moment. Our future. The words settled between us like a glass placed carefully on a table. He didn't panic. Not yet, because he still believed conversation could recalibrate me. What he didn't know was that the conversation was no longer the arena. Paperwork was. The decision had been made. Not in anger, not in heartbreak, in alignment. And once alignment locks in, it does not reverse easily. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. There is something profoundly stabilizing about logistics. Documents don't argue. Timelines don't manipulate. Signatures don't reinterpret themselves the next morning. I did not change my tone with him. I did not withdraw affection dramatically. I simply redirected energy. The first shift was financial insulation. My solicitor advised restraint and precision. I did not drain accounts or trigger alarms. I transferred only what was legally mine, clearly traceable consulting income that had always been documented as separate earnings, even though we pooled most of it. The key was not secrecy, it was timing. I updated passwords, not in paranoia, but in prudence, enabled additional authentication on professional accounts, consolidated investment records into a single encrypted file, printed copies of mortgage documents and tax returns. All of it is ordinary. All of it is unremarkable. From the outside, I looked like a woman organizing paperwork, which technically I was. At dinner one evening, he mentioned another upcoming conference, 2 nights away, same city as before. I nodded. When? Mid-next month. That works. It startled him, I think. The absence of follow-up questions, no scheduling concerns, no subtle probing. Silence once again did the work. The legal filing was submitted quietly. In our jurisdiction, initial paperwork does not arrive with drama. It arrives with envelope edges and official letterhead. There would be time before he received notice. Time I used carefully. I scheduled a valuation of our home under the pretense of refinancing options. I met with a financial advisor to map post-separation scenarios. I reviewed pension allocations and long-term projections. There is clarity in numbers. They do not beg. They do not promise. They reveal. Meanwhile, he oscillated between mild attentiveness and distracted distance. One evening, he reached for my hand across the sofa. "You feel far away lately," he said softly. "I'm exactly where I am," I replied. He searched my face, trying to decode that. Before I would have elaborated. Reassured, smoothed. Now I let him sit with ambiguity. The most powerful position is not anger. It is certainty without announcement. I began sorting my personal belongings. Not packing, just categorizing. Important documents in one drawer, sentimental items photographed and archived digitally. My journal is placed in a locked case. If the conversation turned volatile later, I would not scramble. There is dignity in preparation. One afternoon, while reviewing bank statements again, I noticed a transfer I hadn't seen before. Not large, just misplaced. A reimbursement from his company was deposited into a secondary account I rarely monitored. The pattern was clear now. He had not only built emotional intimacy elsewhere, he had begun separating resources subtly. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was intentional. And intention changes everything. I forwarded the statement to my solicitor without comment. The machine was already in motion. At night, lying beside him, I felt an unexpected calm. Not triumph, not bitterness, relief. Because indecision is exhausting. Action, even quiet action, restores equilibrium. He still believed we were in a phase, a mood, a temporary drift that could be corrected with a weekend away or a well-timed apology. What he did not understand was this. Once I began moving in silence, the outcome was no longer negotiable. It was unfolding, and by the time he realized it, the structure would already be set. The consequences did not arrive with shouting. They arrived in confusion. The first visible shift was subtle. He began sensing a loss he couldn't name. I stopped anticipating his needs. Not maliciously, just factually. If he forgot to confirm dinner reservations with friends, I did not step in to repair it. If he overlooked a bill, I let the reminder email land in his inbox untouched. If he complained about exhaustion, I listened. But I no longer reorganized my schedule to compensate. He began misplacing things more often. Deadlines slipped. He forgot his mother's birthday. Normally, I would have quietly handled all of that. This time, I let consequences remain attached to their origin. One evening, he stood in the kitchen holding his phone, frowning. "Did we confirm that table for Saturday?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I replied calmly. "You usually handle that. I've been focused on other priorities." He blinked. "What priorities?" "Mine." It wasn't confrontational. It was informational. And that is when the imbalance began to surface. Without my constant calibration, his life felt slightly unstable. Not collapsing, just less optimized. He grew more attentive for a few days, cooked dinner once, suggested we watch something together. I accepted politely, but something had changed in my posture. Engagement was no longer automatic. He began asking more direct questions. "Are you unhappy?" "I'm evaluating." "Evaluating what?" "Our alignment." The words unsettled him. They sounded corporate, distant, not emotional enough to argue with. He tried warmth. "You know I love you." I met his eyes evenly. "I know you're comfortable." That was the first time I saw real fear flicker. Comfort can be replaced. Love, when unexamined, can erode quietly. Meanwhile, external consequences gathered. At work, his performance dipped slightly. He mentioned tension with the same colleague. She had become complicated. Emotional expectations, he implied. pressure he hadn't anticipated. I listened without commentary. You don't have anything to say? He asked. About? About that. It sounds complex. That was all. He studied me as if trying to detect jealousy, anger, anything he could respond to. There was none, not because I felt nothing, but because my feelings were no longer available for negotiation. The legal notice was processed internally during that week. I knew the approximate timeline of when it would reach him. I did not anticipate the exact hour, but I understood the window. On Thursday afternoon, he called me. His voice was tight. Did you file something? Yes? A pause. You're divorcing me? I've initiated the process. There it was. No accusation, no mention of her, just structure. Gwyneth, why? His tone wasn't angry, it was stunned. We're no longer aligned. That's it? That's sufficient. Silence stretched across the line. You didn't even talk to me, I observed. He exhaled sharply. Observed what? I let the silence answer. For the first time, he did not attempt to rewrite the narrative. Because paperwork is harder to argue with than memory, the consequences had begun. Not as punishment, but as physics. When support is withdrawn from a structure built unevenly, the imbalance becomes visible. He felt it now, not as an accusation, due to absence. And absence, when unexpected, is louder than confrontation. Panic is rarely loud at first. It's disoriented. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. I was sitting at the dining table with my journal open. Not writing, just present. The house felt still, but not tense, almost neutral. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure how to enter his own home. You're serious, he said. Yes? He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. His movements were controlled, but his eyes were unsettled. He had always been confident in conversation, adept at shaping tone, redirecting energy. Now he didn't know where to begin. This is about her, he said finally. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer immediately. You don't have to confirm it, I said calmly. I don't need details. His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't what you thought. That phrase. I almost smiled at the predictability of it. I don't need it to be anything specific, I replied. It was enough. Enough for what? For me to see the pattern. He leaned back, frustrated now. Not explosive, just searching for ground. We were just talking. It got complicated. I was going to handle it. When? He opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth is, affairs rarely end because of moral awakening. They end because of exposure or inconvenience. I never meant to hurt you, he said quietly, and I believed him. Intent, however, does not neutralize impact. I know, I said. That seemed to destabilize him more than anger would have. You're not even angry, he said almost accusingly. I was, I answered. Before clarity, he rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling. We can fix this. People fix worse. There it was, the language of repair. Weekend retreats, therapy, new boundaries, deleted contacts, promises spoken into fragile air. I looked at him carefully. What would you be fixing? I asked. Our marriage. Our marriage functioned because I was compensating, I said softly. I'm no longer willing to do that. He stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. I would have ended it, he insisted, if you'd just talked to me. I did talk, I said. For years, you just didn't hear anything urgent. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, just definitive. You're throwing everything away, he said finally. No, I replied evenly. I'm keeping what's mine. That was the moment he understood this wasn't leverage for negotiation. It wasn't a strategy to provoke remorse. It was structural. I'll cut contact, he said quickly. I'll show you. I'll prove it. I don't require proof, I said. I require alignment. And we can't get there? I held his gaze without softness, without cruelty. We're already past it. Panic at that point began turning into regret. Not loud regret, just the slow realization that timing matters. Those opportunities for correction close quietly when ignored long enough. He had assumed endurance. He had mistaken patience for permanence. And now he was trying to rebuild trust in a space where I had already withdrawn investment. He wasn't a monster. He was late. And lateness, in matters of dignity, cannot be negotiated. The process continued forward, irreversible. The actual confrontation happened 2 weeks later. Not with him, with her. He didn't know she had requested to see me. I suspect she believed there were things I deserved to hear, or perhaps things she needed to release from her own conscience. She knocked on my door on a gray Thursday afternoon. For a moment, I simply looked at her through the glass panel. Composed, well-dressed, intelligent eyes, younger than me, but not naive. I opened the door. Yes? I'm sorry to come unannounced, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was tension beneath it. I thought you should hear something from me directly. I stepped aside and let her in. No dramatic silence, no trembling hands. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same room where I had once hosted dinner parties, once laughed at stories that had quietly rewritten me. She looked around briefly, taking in the space. He didn't tell me you'd filed, she said. I didn't inform him in advance. Her expression shifted, something between admiration and discomfort. I didn't know how serious this was, she admitted. He said you two were distant, that it was complicated. It was, I replied. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't supposed to become what it did. I nodded. It rarely is. There was no hostility in my tone, no accusation, just acknowledgement. She hesitated. I didn't plan to care about him. That's not something people usually plan. She met my eyes then, searching for anger, for superiority, for cruelty. I offered none. I ended it, she said, when I realized he wasn't being honest with either of us. That detail did not surprise me. I'm glad you chose clarity, I said. You're not going to yell at me? She asked, almost bewildered. No. Why? Because this wasn't yours to protect. The words hung in the air between us. She blinked, absorbing that. He made it sound like your marriage was stable but empty. Stable, I said evenly. Yes, empty, only on one side. A flicker of shame crossed her face. I thought he was trapped, she admitted quietly. He wasn't, I replied. He was comfortable. Silence settled. Not tense, just real. The confrontation neither of them planned became my awakening, I said finally, more to myself than to her. She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? I mean, I stopped doubting my perception. I watched her process that. I didn't come to compete with you, she said. I came because I realized I had participated in something that diminished you. You participated in something he initiated? I corrected gently. Responsibility has hierarchy. Her shoulders lowered slightly, as if something inside her unclenched. I'm sorry, she said, not theatrically, not dramatically, just sincerely. I accept that, I replied. There was nothing else to negotiate. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door. You're very calm, she observed. I'm very clear, I corrected softly. After she left, I closed the door and stood there for a moment. Not shaking, not breaking, just aware. The confrontation had not erupted. It had clarified. There is a kind of power in refusing spectacle, in declining to perform devastation for someone else's narrative. That afternoon, I realized something essential. I had not lost a marriage. I had shed a misalignment. And there is dignity in that. The paperwork was finalized 3 months later. No courtroom theatrics, no dramatic testimony, just signatures, timelines, transfers. The house was sold, assets divided, accounts separated with clinical precision. He moved into a flat across the city. I relocated closer to the sea. The practical dismantling of a marriage is surprisingly unromantic. It's measured in valuations and scheduled calls, not tears. People expected me to look broken. They tilted their heads when they asked how I was doing. You seem composed, one friend observed carefully, as if composure itself were suspicious. I am, I answered. Composure, I've learned, is not suppression. It's alignment. For the first time in years, my internal world matched my external behavior. I no longer filtered my instincts. I no longer recalibrated my tone to maintain comfort. I speak fully now. Not loudly, fully. There's a difference. I still wake early, still review documents with my silver fountain pen, still manage spreadsheets. But now, those habits feel like extensions of me, not punchlines in someone else's story. In the early weeks after the separation, he reached out occasionally. Logistical questions at first, then softer messages. I miss us. I've been thinking. I didn't realize how much you held together. I read them calmly. He was not wrong. But realization after rupture does not rebuild the structure. One evening, he called and asked if we could meet for coffee. We owe ourselves that, he said. I considered it. Then I asked myself a simple question. Would this conversation add clarity or attempt revision? I declined. Not cruelly, not coldly, just decisively. I wish you well, I told him. And I meant it. Bitterness requires ongoing attachment. I no longer have that. I do not hate him. I do not hate her. What happened was not explosive betrayal. It was gradual misalignment that I allowed for too long. My awakening was not discovering the affair. It was recognizing my own erosion before it became irreversible. There is a particular freedom in reclaiming narrative authority. I am no longer the stabilizer in someone else's imbalance. I am the architect of my own structure. I've begun teaching small workshops now. Corporate ethics? Yes. But also communication boundaries. Women attend mostly, some married, some single. Many are quietly exhausted from being the steady one. I don't tell them to leave. I tell them to observe, to stop editing themselves prematurely, to treat their discomfort as data. Because clarity, once trusted, changes posture, and posture changes the outcome. When I walk now, I do not feel smaller. I feel proportionate. There is no triumph in that, no dramatic glow-up montage, just steadiness that belongs to me alone. If someone underestimates me now, it does not wound. It informs. I am still calm, still measured, still thoughtful, but I am no longer performing resilience. I am inhabiting it, and that difference is everything. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a moral that punishes someone. There isn't one. No one was publicly exposed, no one was humiliated, no one lost everything overnight. What happened was quieter than that. He swore there was no other woman. Then she knocked on my door. But the knock was not the most important moment. The most important moment was the one before it, when I stopped arguing with my own intuition. The confrontation that neither of them planned became my awakening, not because it shattered me, because it aligned me. There is a lesson in that alignment. We often think betrayal is the beginning of an ending, but sometimes the ending begins long before the betrayal, when we start shrinking to preserve peace, when we pre-edit our questions, when we accept partial attention, when we explain away patterns that make us uneasy. I did not leave because he loved someone else. I left because I stopped loving a version of myself that tolerated erasure. That distinction matters. This isn't a story about dramatic strength. It's about quiet sovereignty, about understanding that calm does not mean compliant, that patience does not equal permanence, that dignity does not require spectacle. If you are in a relationship where nothing looks obviously broken, but something inside you feels consistently smaller, pause. Not to accuse, not to panic, just to observe. Ask yourself, are you choosing silence or defaulting to it? Are you supported or merely relied upon? Are you aligned or just enduring? Sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's clarity followed by action. And action doesn't have to be loud to be irreversible. I don't regret my marriage. It taught me precision. It taught me restraint. It taught me that love without mutual awareness becomes imbalanced. Most of all, it taught me this. The moment you trust your perception, you reclaim your power. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever mistaken your calm for weakness? And what changed when you realized it wasn't? Tell me in the comments.